Here, thank you for joining. Let me try to share my screen.
May I introduce you since
Oh,
that's
sorry, I apologize. I'm really excited.
it's our incredible pleasure to have Merve Aktar here today with us. She's an assistant professor in comparative literature at Ibn Khaldun University, and she is a co-founder of the Munazara and Argumentation Ethics Research Center. And her interest is in the nature and progress of cognitive transformation, and she approaches this from an English literature point of view, which is incredibly exciting. When I saw her presentation at the OSA conference, and remember, I leaned back, I was like, we have to have her. So
Thanks.
I'm really excited to have her give a talk here, and she's now going to tell us about the saving grace of uncertainty, reimagining unreasonable responsibility and argument. Please take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Are my slides showing and is my voice clear enough? Right. Great, thank you. So I begin by saying the necessity of paying critical attention to the dispositions and actions of arguers in argument evaluation put forward by virtue argumentation theories is increasingly being taken into consideration. However, the questions begin where the internality of human cognition and motivation begin. As Dale Hampel justly notes in his thoughtful defense of seeing the people in the arguments, quote, arguers are still largely opaque to us, and as a result, close quote, evaluation criteria are channeled towards observable patterns of behavior with the predicted and predictable outcomes. The ends of these criteria are to set the rules for and to improve the practical epistemic execution of argumentation, and in accordance with this epistemic approach to understanding the arguer in the context of argument as dialectical procedure, a recent proposition by Gascon is that what we need is a rather broad and complex conception of what an excellently and admirably conducted argumentative discussion looks like. Since the virtue definition of a good argument depends in part on evaluating its participants' mindsets, hard as it may be, my question is whether we have addressed the ideological foundations of our conception of autonomous reasoning agents necessary to conceive of said argumentative discussion. I ask this because the literature and argumentation theories, including in the specified work by Gascon, underscores the primary responsibilist intellectual virtue of the arguer as being, quote, reasonable. This is understandable, and we need to get into its foundations to understand how it's working as well as how it's causing problems today. Gascon's compelling critique of the pragma-dialectical approach to the epistemic requirement of reasonableness begins with the issue of its conflation with rationality, defined as, quote, utilizing one's faculty of reason in an appropriate way, end quote. This is followed by the observations that the pragma-dialectical approach issues any resort to fundamental beliefs as matter of agreement rather than as matters of indubitability, and emphasizes the role of systematic criticism through critical dialogue. In other words, the process begins with skepticism at its base and moves with a view towards error detection, an overall negatively charged experience. The proposition concerning virtue argumentation theory is that it would offer a way to see the epistemic virtue of reasonableness as a gateway to understanding and strengthening the, quote, philosophical estate, end quote, of argumentation, so that the road would be paved for presenting a rich conception of argumentative excellence. Essentially, my question towards the underlying philosophy of reasonableness aligns with this proposition to strengthen the philosophical estate in virtue terms. The two nodes where my query differs are the ideological cultural foundations of said logical estate and the non-epistemic moral component of reasonableness. Dispositional virtues may be broadly divided into the intellectual and the moral, with reasonableness being classed firmly in the intellectual virtues. There is no moral nor ontological component to reasonableness, which is taken for granted, and so similar agent-based virtue approaches likewise set up the arguer as intellectually virtuous thinker. For example, Siegel makes the identification that intellectually virtuous thinking is thinking that manifests intellectual virtue. It is thinking that is some combination of intellectually modest, intellectually courageous, open-minded, fair-minded, inquisitive, diligent, resourceful, patient, careful, thorough, charitable, and/or generous. While each virtue on the list I read out appear to be independent, they are all the handmaidens to the virtue of rational reasonableness. What do I mean by this, and why does it matter that reasonableness is exclusively epistemic in nature? Because it was not always this way. In classical and pre-modern philosophies, the ontic and the epistemic were inextricably linked. It is not that I am advocating a return to these worldviews, which I will not get into, but rather to draw attention to what was lost in the transition. Reasonableness in our understanding belongs to the self-possessed subject, with connection to mental processes and their evaluations, but no connection to non-cerebral processes that are internal, such as emotions and imagination, nor to a natural other externally. By connection, I mean responsibility, a kind of responsibility towards the other in the practice of reason. This intellectual virtue is understood differently in positivist approaches and rationalist approaches, and I will concentrate on the latter, on rationalist approach, as it is what has made its way to our day. Rationality is the philosophical estate upon which most contemporary scholarly as well as institutional processes operate, with its roots in Enlightenment philosophies of mind during the 1700s and resurgence in the cognitive revolution of the 1950s. The principal name attributable for the modern rational shift, if not rift, from the classical philosophies of Plato and Aristotle is Descartes, of course. The Aristotelian conjoined soul and mind with the telos of cognitive achievement, the ultimate good, is surgically separated into the mind-body complex, with the soul lingering as a mechanistic start button for cognition or a ghost in the human machine. Basically, innate universal truths and teleological orientation are taken fully out of the picture, hence the pragma-dialectical emphasis on absolute fallibility per Gascon, and hence the Aristotelian grounds of virtue argumentation theories wherein the focus is on mental capacities and processes as divested from the discussion of souls, universal truths, or matters of absolute indubitability. In Sources of the Self, oh no, not yet. In Sources, yeah, actually it is the right. Self, the Making of Modern Identity, Charles Taylor explains that we could say rationality is no longer defined substantively in terms of the order of being, but rather procedurally in terms of the standards by which we construct orders in science and life. For Plato, to be rational, we have to be right about the order of things. For Descartes, rationality means thinking according to certain canons. The judgment now turns on properties of the activity of thinking rather than on the substantive beliefs which emerge from it. And the modern conception of reason is procedural. What we are called on to do is not to become contemplators of order, but rather to construct a picture of things following the canons of rational thinking. The rational subject is primarily one who utilizes his or her reason in the proper ways so as to form empirically valid representations of outer realities in his or her mind. Thinking according to certain canons is the reference to procedure and proceduralism, both of which are the central concerns of argumentation theories, virtue-driven or not. This appeal to procedure is in opposition to older religious, mystical, and other traditions other sort of traditions wherein acceptable epistemological sources include and are not limited to divine sources, visions, dreams, inspiration, imagination, and gasp feelings. So reasonableness as a virtue is to suppress emotion and anything considered mythical, not logical. And Taylor points out that because this ideal of the good is no longer powered by a vision of order, but is rather powered by a sense of the dignity of the thinking being, generosity is the appropriate emotion. And it is not only appropriate, but essential. It is the motor of virtue, so true generosity is the key of all other virtues and a general remedy for all the disorders of the passions. Generosity, it will be remembered, is one of the core virtues proposed by Siegel in his list of intellectual virtues. Considering the context of early modern Europe, of course, the need for absolute disenchantment with the world is understandable and necessary. However, rationalist philosophies in general have an embedded problem related to the conception of reason and its practice. That is the cause of contemporary issues under discussion in argumentation studies. Since the proper use of reason is through subjection of emotions, which entails the endorsement of the idea that the, quote, proper intellectual stance is detached engagement, the attainment of knowledge and the acts of the self-possessed reasoning subject become matters of control and domination. Taylor elaborates on the position of the subject, self or subject in this framework, observing that when the hegemony of reason comes to be understood as rational control, the power to objectify a body, world, and passions, that is to assume a thoroughly instrumental stance towards them, then the sources of moral strength can no longer be seen as outside us in the traditional modes, certainly not in the way that they were for Plato, and I believe also for the Stoics, where they reside in a world order which embodies a good we cannot but love and admire. The objectification of everything external to the self-possessed reasoning agent, who herself assumes a position of self-abstraction or self-objectification in the rejection of emotions, is especially reflected in our conceptual metaphors in the English language. Lakoff and Johnson present myths and metaphors of rational subjectivity and objectivity at length, such as the cognitive association of the idea of rational with up, a metaphor with positive associations, and the idea of emotional with down, a negative one. This extends to the conceptual metaphors of argument, which are collected under the umbrella concept of argument is war. Two examples from Lakoff and Johnson are, I demolished his argument, and you disagree? Okay, shoot. The violence taken for granted here is the direct result of taking an exclusively rational stance to intellectual inquiry, including argumentative discussions in this context. These issues of violence, instrumental stances, and detachment at the expense of connection and meaningful understanding in epistemic encounters were visible in the amazing talks in this year's Ethics of Argumentation speaker series. In the first talk, for example, Katerina Novaes spoke on the issue of reason supremacism in rational argumentation, pointing out the fact that when persuasive in nature, an element of coercion will inevitably be involved. She traced this coercive element to its roots in the early modern development of the philosophies of mind, specifically Cartesian and Kantian theories, in which a foundational premise is that the mental faculty of reason must be, quote, autonomy affirming. Meaning, the rational agent is a self-possessed subject to which all others are potential threats that must be contained and ideally subjugated. Novaes called for alternatives to rational argumentation and took a narrative turn This great talk was followed by the second thought-provoking one by Claire Lockhart on the shift in meaning of the virtue of caritas from one rooted morally in universal love and solidarity to one rooted epistemically in agents giving the benefit of the doubt to their interlocutors. Both talks especially demonstrated how cerebral as well as how procedural our core concepts have become. And this phenomenon has been reinforced time and time again, which brings me to my issue with our collective worldview in general and with argumentation in particular. The way we take our thinking of the arguer as reasonable or rational agent for granted. The worldview embedded in this concept that affects everything from the way we see and treat our interlocutors to the way we conceive of and understand cognitive achievement in the sense put forward by Cohen, namely, there are more cognitive achievements than justification and knowledge, and there are more cognitive failings than ignorance and error. We do want knowledge of the world, of course, but we also want to understand it. That includes prominently understanding the other people who share the world with us. Cohen and Miller expand on what is meant by understanding the other people who share the world with us in their study on compathetic argumentation, identifying understanding as one of mutual recognition and cooperation, rather than as one of gaining insight so as to coerce and control. Cognitive compathy is invaluable to my investment in the nature of unreasonable responsibility in arguers, as cooperation in the sense advocated by Cohen and Miller necessitates mutual feelings of responsibility for the other. They define compathy as a multi-agent version of sympathy in which all parties participate. Sympathy is exactingly differentiated from empathy in that it is not just a recognition of the other's emotional states, but requires, quote, that we share relevant ends and values, close quote. So the issue of a baseline agreement in the practice of reasonableness is addressed by this emotional virtue. A virtue rooted in an earlier version that carries heavy philosophical baggage regarding meaning and scope. Sympathy was an especially important term rooted in the cognitive faculty of the imagination in the aftermath of the Enlightenment and French revolutions, when individual and societal bonds and responsibilities were being cast anew. In the theory of modern moral sentiments, Adam Smith, for example, observes that as we have no immediate experience of what other men feel, we can form no idea of the manner in which they are affected, but by conceiving what we ourselves feel in the like situation. Though our brother is upon the rack, as long as we ourselves are at our ease, our senses will never inform us of what he suffers. They never did and never can carry us beyond our own person, and it is by the imagination only that we can form any conception of what are his sensations. By the imagination, we place ourselves in his situation. This link to imagination will be brought up shortly in the context of cognitive compathy, but moving on, there is an implicit critique of the rational arguer in the conception of cognitive compathy, coupled with a shift in the dominant organ of empirical perception central to the reasoning self. Cohen and Miller claim that, quote, a critical eye might make us better readers, but a sympathetic ear makes us better interpreters. In the dethroning of the eye as central organ, the primary perceptive organ, the hegemonic conception of the self-possessed I is likewise negated. In fact, they state that for mutual sharing of foundational values, the, quote, gestalt of each arguer, quote, we have to surrender a part of our autonomy and allow a part of our understanding to be molded by the other's words. Notice the conceptual metaphors in this claim representing the act of listening, sharing, and being open to change as a surrender of autonomy. The war metaphor continues with the self as a fort or contained area under attack. This counter-hegemonic approach extends to the central object of theoretical studies and evaluations, the rational acts of the arguers. Instead, the goal of compathetic argumentation is the passive feature of, quote, creative listening. This is the essential link to imagination, and I would like to dwell on the treatment of creative listening as it is strongly resonant of British Romantic poetical concept coined by the visionary poet John Keats, negative capability. Negative capability, a contradiction in terms, is the virtue Keats desires for men of achievement. It is the capability of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. It is a kind of surrender of the self-possessed I, so as to allow the other to act on it without the self's reaction to process and make sense of it. In Cohen and Miller's account of creative listening, passivity is sustained by the deeper activity of opening oneself and participating in a collaborative process that gives the audience ownership of the jointly created meanings. The process of creative listening is what enables a person to hear and understand something as if it were new. The ability to flex familiar concepts and beliefs, or even an entire worldview, to recognize the gestalt that is being shared by the speaker. It can be compared to learning how to ride a motorcycle around a corner. You must feel the motorcycle becoming part of your body schema. The creative element, the flexing of what is familiar so that it may be seen and understood in a new and deeper light, potentially facilitating growth and transformative change, pertains to the realm of the imagination, the age-old nemesis of reason. And it has made an exciting comeback in argumentation theories, notably as proposed by Michael Bauntrag in his article, Others and Imagination in Reasoning and Argumentation, Improving Our Critical Creative Capacity, 2 years after the introduction of compathy. It is probably necessary to digress at this point so as to note that neither I nor the authors I cite are against the epistemic norm and necessity of reason. My stance aligns more with the romantic philosophical projects of reconnecting the parts of what was once, in prehistory, the world of mythic and magic, a unified whole. Part of the Enlightenment humanist rejection of the evidence, if not very presence of emotion, is the phenomenon's connection to what is bodily, as opposed to reason, which is associated with the human mind as a transcendent phenomenon, separate from and superior to the natural material world. There are in fact 2 terms used by British Romantic poets to discuss the creative capacity of the mind: fancy and imagination. Fancy, the former, is the derogatory and isolationist sense which continues to be in critical use today, whereas the latter, imagination, is conceptualized by 2 especially sort of romantic, primary romantic poets, Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Percy Shelley, in a unified account of a mind containing potential of transformation. Coleridge defines imagination as a primary faculty of the mind and fancy as a secondary one. The latter is concerned with memory and mental associations, not being creative nor transformative, but just associative and playful. The primary faculty of the imagination, in contrast, is a living power and prime agent of all human perception. It is creative, and it is a unifying force central to the formation and continuity of the self, according to Coleridge. Shelley likewise emphasizes the essential and creative nature of the imagination, connecting directly with the faculty of reason to form a unified intellect. In the first paragraph of his Defense of Poetry, part the first, reason and imagination are defined as follows, and this is a very long quote, but I found that it is something worth paying attention to in terms of how imagination is treated and not treated today. According to one mode of regarding those two classes of mental action, which are called reason and imagination, the former may be considered as mind contemplating the relations borne by one thought to another, however produced, and the latter as mind acting upon those thoughts so as to color them with its own light, and composing from them as from elements other thoughts, each containing within itself the principle of its own integrity. The one is to the poiein, or the principle of synthesis, so this is reason, and has for its objects those forms which are common to universal nature and existence itself. The other, imagination, is the logizane, I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, or principle of analysis, and its action regards the relations of things simply as relations, considering thoughts not in their integral unity, but as the algebraical representations which conduct to certain general results. Reason is the enumeration of quantities already known. Imagination is the perception of the value of those quantities, both separately and as a whole. Reason respects the differences, and imagination the similitudes of things. Reason is to imagination as the instrument to the agent, as the body to the spirit, as the shadow to the substance. Notice how imagination is linked in Latin to logizane, to logic. And it is the faculty of analysis and creativity. Shelley is also one of the foremost proponents of the doctrine of sympathy, and it may be seen how imagination plays a crucial role in fostering a gestalt between different selves, on account of the mental action's role in the analogical synthesis of information. This emphasis on the sympathetic as well as creative imagination is what drew me to the concept of cognitive competence as a form of unreasonable responsibility, as well as to the concept of the critical creative capacity in Baumtrog's article that I will introduce now. The agent-based target of critical creative capacity is the improvement of individuals' practical reasoning by way of imagining an interlocutor other or universal audience. In the immediate outset of the study, Baumtrog takes care to differentiate between imagination and creativity, the latter which he uses, providing a footnote that distinguishes between the two. Oh, wait, what is this? Oh, there's a, excuse me, the slides are gone awry. Okay, there's a missing slide for some reason. Okay, so between imagination and creativity, the latter which he uses, providing a footnote that distinguishes between the two. So this is the footnote where there's the definition of imagination and creativity. Ken Robinson distinguishes imagination and creativity. For him, imagination is, quote, the process of bringing to mind things that are not present to our senses. And creativity is described as a kind of applied imagination, a doing. Although I am sympathetic to this distinction in light of the differing uses of the terms in the other sources I draw on, it is not enforced here. For present purposes, the terms can be taken broadly and as synonymous. So Robinson's definition of imagination falls squarely within that of fancy. And describing creativity as applied imagination is interesting, Baumtrog notes that the two will be used synonymously, and this is the only issue I have with his important, vitally necessary work on reframing the critical self. The issue with conflating fancy with imagination in the treatment of creativity is that plays into the derogatory rationalist treatment of imagination as a subordinate faculty useful for just basic mental play. A break from the serious job, if you will. Revising this stance is all the more crucial given that the critical creative capacity means to address what is identified as the main pitfall to agents' reasonable argument procedures, cognitive biases, the divisive classifications embedded in the rational systems of the mind. I'm not under the illusion that the proposed critical creative capacity aims at fostering compathy, nor that it is invested in a non-epistemic form of cognitive achievement. Baumtrog channels this creative skill or tool towards improvement of one's ability to evaluate one's own arguments against standards of objectivity. In terms of reasonableness as standard, the creative critical capacity is meant to address the following, quote, there is something going on with these slides. How did those slides disappear? Okay. Identifies an individual's skills and dispositions to create, imagine, think up the appropriate number and diversity of considerations and counter considerations, which are appropriately relevant to the occurring reasoning or argumentation, while 3, attributing the appropriate role and weight to each, close quote. I'm rather invested in 2 things. Firstly, Baumtrog's opening to the question of the role imagination plays in the practice of reasonableness with reference to Tyndale. Philosophically, if Tyndale is right and the ability to imagine counterarguments is synonymous with the ability to evaluate one's own arguments, then investigating the imagination of reasons and counterarguments should be of high philosophical interest. If philosophers are the ones who declare the conditions for what is reasonable and unreasonable, they need to account for the creative imaginative ability of the reasoner. They need to determine if an individual who makes a poor decision because of a natural, explainable lack of creativity should be declared unreasonable in the same way another more imaginative person could be. While this treatment of imagination as means of evaluating the reasonableness of an arguer is not visibly conducive to fostering moral responsibility, Baumtrog does assert that the ability to evaluate one's own arguments is synonymous with the ability to imagine such a universal audience or community, end quote. This imaginative community contains the seeds of potential in my view. Secondly, I am interested in the suggestion that creative thinking can be blended with critical thinking, this is a quote, so that both are developed as a skill and a disposition, end quote. And that this facilitates, quote, divergent thinking. Divergent thinking is imaginative and, quote, attempts to break the rules, transcend frameworks, and create novel products, end quote. This in turn opens up the possibility that current standards of reasonableness and objectivity may be thought anew. I will close with quotes from 2 poems by William Blake. Radical, visionary, romantic poet who fiercely defied the strictly rationalist and positivist philosophies of Descartes, Bacon, Newton, and Locke especially, arguing for the innate transformative and unifying capacity of the creative imagination. In his extensive mythology of the realm of Albion, which the University of Toronto notes explains as humanity seen as a single man identified with England. And Blake has a whole mythology around it. The transcendental fourfold human psyche has fallen and separated into the personified male specter and the personified female emanation. So emanation is nature as a field of human creation, and the specter is the withdrawn subjective mind. It is the selfhood and the reasoning power of man. This is a quote from Blake's Jerusalem. And when separated from imagination and closing itself as in steel in a ratio of things of memory, it hence frames laws and moralities. So Blake's magnum opus, Jerusalem, contains 2 lines in verse, spoken by recurring character Loss, who's not a specter, but he is in touch with his own specters and emanations. And the 2 lines he speaks, and these 2 lines have gained a life of their own. Like most people, even if they haven't read Blake, they'll probably recognize this couplet. So I must create a system, like Law stands in London building Galganuza, a system, compelling his spectre to labor's mighty, trembling in fear. The spectre weeps, but Loss unmoved by tears or threats remains. I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's. I will not reason and compare. My business is to create. Through Loss, which, in explanations of the mythology, some people read his name backwards to say Sol or sun. He is pointing out how man-made systems based on these rationalist and positivist principles are essentially sort of meant to enslave men, and Blake carries issue with that. He is a radical revolutionary. So he said, I must create a system or be enslaved by another man's. My business is to create, not to reason and compare. And in his second poem, which is, of course, it's better to see these in their plate forms, but it would have been too long, so I just included the text. There is no natural religion. Blake actually does sort of point out the problems with the rationalist philosophy, the reasoning self. So the argument, and he does point out his poem, his book, as an argument in 6 parts. It begins, man has no notion of moral fitness but from education. Naturally, he is only a natural organ, subject to sense. Man cannot naturally perceive but through his natural or bodily organs. Man, by his reasoning power, can only compare and judge of what he has already perceived. From a perception of only 3 senses or 3 elements, none could deduce a 4th or 5th. None could have other than natural or organic thoughts if he had none but organic perceptions. So this is sort of man in sort of nature, the natural laws, and the rule of reason. Man's desires, the mechanistic universe, man's desires are limited by his perceptions. None can desire what he has not perceived. The desires and perceptions of man, untaught by anything but organs of sense, must be limited to objects of sense. And that is the end of my talk. Thank you for listening. I will be happy to sort of